Hello, my name's Olorotimi Osha. We are still in the month of May. We are halfway through the uh, year 2026. And today I want to continue my discussion on um, the channeling uh, of Greek tragedy, the Greek tragedy Ajax in the CIA's Operation Ajax. So, Operation Ajax was the first CIA led false CIA led and directed false flag operation to overthrow a foreign government. I've done a video discussing the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammed Mossadegh of Iran in order to consolidate the dictatorship of the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was more aligned with American oil interests in Iran and the Middle East. So I'm not going to go into the specifics and give the background. I want to keep this video short and immediately dive into uh, the elements of the Greek tragedy, uh, Ajax, and how they correlate with uh, elements of CIA, activities in Operation Ajax, which overthrew Mohammed uh, Mossadegh. So let me quickly give some of the elements of the tragedy by the Greek poet Sophocles. So it's called Ajax. Now, importantly, Ajax was designed for the stage by Sophocles because it was performed in the festival of uh, uh, Dionysian, right? The festival of Dionysian was a competitive festival during classical Greek times. This was around 441, 442 BC. Um, of course, if anybody knows a little bit about Greek mythology, uh, uh, Dionysus is the Greek god of wine and theater. So you can see it's actually fitting that um, this tragedy was performed during the Dionysian festival. So Sophocles designed the Ajax, that's it, tragedy Ajax for the stage, right? He designed it for the stage. So I've already done a video. You can watch that video discussing how um, the story that narrating the story of Ajax and how he slaughtered. He was made mad by the goddess Athena, and he slaughtered animals in his madness, thinking that the animals were his rivals, his enemies, Odysseus, uh, Agamemnon, and Menelaus, but they weren't. He was just crazy and he slaughtered the animals. And out of shame, he ends up committing suicide on stage. So, first of all, an important element is that uh, the the tragedy Ajax was staged, right? It was staged, it was performed on stage. And another important element is the fact that there was subterfuge in the narrative, in the drama. There was a lot of subterfuge that was used, especially in the final speech by Ajax, right? Ajax gives a final speech, uh, to his wife. His wife, um, uh, Tecmessa, who had appealed to him not to commit suicide because Ajax, once he discovered his folly, once he discovered that he had slaughtered animals and he'd gone mad, been made mad by Athena and slaughtered animals, he felt ashamed. And of course, he his plan was to commit suicide, that thinking that was the only way to redeem his honor, that if he committed suicide. but his wife talked him out of it so that they could jointly raise their son. And so he pretends, he gives this speech, and the speech suggests that he's not going to commit suicide. He's not going to kill himself, but he'd resigned himself to uh, to the consequences, whatever the outcome would be, but he was not going to take his own life, and yeah, but he would be determined to live. And however, he suddenly, the audience discovers that, he's actually given a deceptive speech, a very misleading speech, and he ends up committing suicide, right? He kills himself by falling on his sword on stage. So it's staged, it's full of subterfuge. Things are not what exactly they appear to be on the surface, right? Things are cosmetic. You have to go deeper to understand what's really going on. So things are misleading. There's a lot of deception, right? Straw man, and so that's another important element. It's staged. There's deception, and so those are important elements, right? And one would find that these elements are channeled in uh, they're channeled in the naming of the plan to overthrow the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. And, so let me dive quickly into the elements, the activities of the CIA. So, amongst the things that the Directorate of Plans, which was under Frank Wisner, I've done a video discussing Frank Wisner. So, Frank Wisner is a character. Uh, he was the one who supervised, he authorized the overthrow of the prime minister of Iran through Operation Ajax, and he was head of uh, the Office of Policy Coordination. It became absorbed the uh, into the CIA as directorate of plans, right? And he led this office, and their role was in it was designed for obfuscation. Obfuscation means to obscure things, right? Obfuscation. Their activities included sabotage, right? Uh, so they were the covert they were for the covert, they're designed as a covert, um, uh, the office was designed for covert action, right? So when the CIA was established, their central aim was, intelligence collection, right? So there's one thing to gather intelligence, just gather information and intelligence. There's another thing to act on intelligence, or use intelligence in a certain way. So one of the things that the Office of Policy Coordination, which became the Directorate of Plans, did was they used um, propaganda, right? They used propaganda as a tool, disinformation, right? They used disinformation, propaganda. They worked on foreign subversion, right? Subversion of foreign states. They sponsored insurgents, right? Uh, they sponsored guerrilla warfare in foreign lands, right? So importantly, this was the era of the Cold War, right? We're talking about the 1950s. This was the era of the Cold War between the USA and USSR, between capitalism and communism, right? And this guy who oversaw Operation Ajax, that's Frank Wisner, they said he was obsessed with anti-communism. He was obsessed with anti-Russian, being anti-Russian, right? He had this phobia of Russians, right? And he was to an obsession. It's interesting that he would eventually have suffer a nervous breakdown late around 1958, and He was diagnosed with manic depression, which is which is called bipolar disorder today. And eventually he took his life. He committed suicide in 1965. Um, but importantly, the office he led, their activities, their operations included sabotage, economic warfare, in foreign lands. That's the mandate of the CIA. They're not supposed to conduct their activities within the United States amongst Americans because they'd be violating the constitutional rights of Americans. By the way, espionage is illegal, right? Because if you were in a foreign land and they find out that you're a spy, you're foreign spy, that's your job, they automatically suspect that you're doing something that your job is to engage in subversive activities, and you'll be arrested. So you see, when they discover people are spies and they're in foreign lands, they're normally detained, right? They're detained. Um, so normally people who work for the CIA or intelligence outfits, they use a cover, right? They use a cover. There's an interesting article by Carl Bernstein, uh, who Carl Bernstein was one of the heroes of the Watergate scandal, who one of the journalists, one half of the duo that investigated and exposed the Watergate scandal, the link of the White House with in the Watergate scandal. And so he wrote an article regarding the nexus between the CIA and the media, claiming that the CIA uses many major media houses and journalists as cover, right? So, so that's just showing that, well, that spying is illegal. Many times, the CIA, people who are intelligence agents, they use a cover, right? So many times, and you see the initial connection between the Office of Policy Coordination, and which dealt with espionage, right? Clandestine activities, and the connection with the State Department. So it was actually initially answerable to the State Department, even though it was within the department, within the CIA, but it was accountable to the State Department until it was eventually absorbed by a CIA director, and it was reorganized within the Directorate of Plans, and it became something else. It became the complete subversive. Sorry, not. I mean, espionage activities, clandestine activities were fully integrated within the CIA. So, again, as I was saying, their tools, their activities, their operations include economic warfare, sabotage, anti sabotage, propaganda, use of disinformation, sponsoring of guerrilla warfare, insurgents, right, um, to overthrow anti-American governments, right? Governments that are, communist leaning and things like that, or that were against American financial interests. So these are some of uh, the activities, and you find that these were consistent with Operation Ajax. So things that they did, um, they the Operation Ajax, the CIA working with British intelligence, because it was actually British intelligence, MI6, that invited um, the US CIA to get involved in this covert plan to overthrow the Prime Minister of Iran, who was nationalizing the oil companies, and to them he seemed to be anti-West, even though he was just asserting Iran's independence. Um, the British, the equivalent of their Operation Ajax, they called it Operation Boot, right? Pretty straightforward. Typical British, they called it Operation Boot. Um, but in any event, the CIA took the lead in executing the plans, and it was the manager on ground was Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt, that was the grandson of the 26th president, Teddy Roosevelt. And part of what they did was to spread disinformation, misleading information, propaganda against the prime minister. And they paid dissidents, right, to protest. They paid people to protest, to march. They were actually paid dissidents. They were paid by the CIA and to demonstrate, to sabotage the government of Mohammed Mossadegh, and eventually it led to chaos and crisis on ground in the nation. It's interesting that I was talking about the Greek god Dionysus, right? Dionysus, you know, for whom the Dionysian festival, uh, you know, the Dionysian festival honors the Greek god Dionysus. Dionysus is known for as a god of wine, the god of theater, and also he's associated with chaos, right? Chaos, ecstasy, a chaotic environment, and so you could see the channeling of Dionysian, which was part of the reason for actually planning the Greek tragedy Ajax by the poet Sophocles. So you see the use of chaos, right, the uh, in the subterfuge to overthrow uh, the prime minister of Iran, Mohammed Mossadegh. So there was chaos. About 200 to 300 people were killed in the crisis that ensued from the use of disinformation and propaganda against the prime minister. Uh, so deception staged the whole, so they made it seem like it was actually a military faction that was against, and that was against the prime minister, because this military faction, they were actually paid. These military officers were actually paid by the CIA, right? But they made it appear that, well, this military faction were acting to satisfy the demands of the Iranian populace. That the Iranian populace was against the government of Prime Minister Mohammed Mossadegh, when that was not the case. He was actually popular. He had the populist support. So that's part of the subterfuge, the deception, the staging, right? So, like I said, the Operation Ajax was actually channeling the Greek tragedy of Sophocles. That's Ajax. Remember the play Ajax was staged, it was performed on a stage, and the use of deception. So you see the parallel in the deceptive speech of um, the deceptive speech of Ajax in the final speech, right? I've already explained that. And so you see the use of deception as well. The actual people who were planning the coup were the CIA, but it was misrepresented as the a faction, a military faction within Iran that was acting in consonance, to demands of the Iranian population, which was not the case. This was all staged. The mass protests were all staged by the CIA. They were paid dissidents, right? So that's another reason why it's called Operation Ajax. And then finally, you can see the break, right? The break from the past. So Dine, Odysseus, right? Odysseus represented a break from Ajax. Ajax, who committed suicide, represented an old order, right? Old, rigid, heroic military order, right? An old honor code, and that's why he ended up committing suicide. And Odysseus, who people will discover, right? Will soon discover in the movie The Odyssey, the upcoming movie to be released, soon to be released by Christopher Nolan, that's created a lot of controversy because One of my favorite actresses, Lupita Nyong'o, who's African like me, is being cast as Helen of Troy. Um, but in any event, the main protagonist, Odysseus, who's played by another main character, somebody I really like, Matt Damon. Odysseus is very clever, right? And he's a very flexible person. He lies a lot. So you see moral flexibility. So moral flexibility, if anybody watches these former CIA officers who have podcasts, Andrew Bustamante and John Kiriakou, right? John Kiriakou says he claimed, I watched a podcast of his in which he claims that the reason why his marriage failed, and he said CIA agents cannot have a successful marriage because they're trained to lie. They're liars. And what Andrew Bustamante calls that art of lying, that pathological line of CIA agents is moral flexibility. That the CIA recruits people who have moral flexibility, right? They'll do things that are wrong, but they can justify it. They can see a bigger picture to it, or whatever. He calls it moral flexibility, and that was the nature of Odysseus. You find out that's who Odysseus is. Odysseus is like an anti-hero, but he's also named called Odysseus of the nimble wits, right? Quick-witted Odysseus, and the goddess Athena favors him. But Odysseus he uses tricks a lot. He lies. He's very comfortable lying, right, to achieve a goal. And in fact, the use of the Trojan horse. Everybody knows Troy, the use of the Trojan horse, very famous. That was actually conceived by Odysseus. So you're going to be watching the Odyssey. Odysseus conceived the Trojan horse that Greek soldiers should hide in a wooden horse so that they can be taken through the impregnable walls of Troy, right? And so maybe we've seen Odysseus before, in encountered Odysseus before. Uh, he's by the way, his Latin name is Ulysses, right? Ulysses, so we probably know him more as Ulysses. I just remembered there's an old film, I think Ulysses, that was done like a long time ago, right, in the 50s, 60s, right? And so Odysseus is Ulysses. So Ulysses is his Latin name. Odysseus is his Greek name, original Greek name. So the Romans had equivalents, right, of Latin names, Latin identities, right, Latin equivalents of Greek, uh, of their Greek deities, Greek heroes, and things like that. For instance, Venus is the Latin equivalent of the goddess Aphrodite, and Ulysses is the Latin name of the Greek name Odysseus, right? So Odysseus and Ulysses, they're the same person, right? Only Ulysses is his name in Latin. So you see moral flexibility, right? Moral flexibility, you see that use of deception, lying, that it's a new era, it's a break from the past. Ajax, he represented an old honor code that was very rigid and was not adaptable. So he commits suicide. While Odysseus, he's actually a good guy, right? He's flexible. He doesn't want to punish the in memory of his adversary, his rival who tried to kill him. He actually honors him, and he argues, persuades Agamemnon, Agamemnon and Menelaus to give Ajax a uh, a hero's burial, right? Even though he'd done something really vile as he tried to kill them, right? So I've done a video explaining the tragedy Ajax, the Greek tragedy Ajax. So these are ways that the CIA was actually channeling the Greeks, and you can see. So the leaders of the CIA at its inception were from elite schools, Ivy Leagues, elite schools. They also often had patrician backgrounds. They came from wealthy backgrounds. So the recruiting of the CIA changed. So back then at its inception, they really wanted to model the British intelligence, right? Because people who went into British intelligence MI6, which is much older, right, than the CIA. They often came from elite backgrounds. Ian Fleming, right, who is, of course, the creator of James Bond, right? He was the author of the James Bond novels. Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming had actually been a British intelligence officer, right? And he came from an aristocratic background. He came from a wealthy banking family, an aristocratic background. Um, he went to an elite school, Eton, and I think he dropped out of college. He didn't, so but I know he at least graduated from Eton. And so were many others, right? The spies, Kim Philby, all those guys who were turncoats. You see, they came from elite backgrounds, and so at the beginning of the CIA, right? The leaders, the people the CIA recruited, they came from elite backgrounds, or they at least went to elite schools, because America likes that, grass to grace, rags to riches theory, a man of ability. But at least, they should be able to pass through elite schools. That's sort of America for you. You see, Alan Dulles was a Princeton graduate. Then law school, he went to my law school, George Washington University Law School. Maybe people don't think it's elite. By the way, George Washington University was once the most expensive university in America. So if you're the most expensive university in America, you're clearly elite, right? It's not an Ivy League, but if they're more expensive than Ivy Leagues, then they're clearly elite. But and Frank Frank Wisner, right, who directed Operation Ajax, he himself, his father was a wealthy man. He was a timber magnate. Interestingly, he was born in Mississippi, but the Bond character, people say uh, Ian Fleming was channeling a lot of Frank Wisner's larger than life uh, uh, life, right? He had this razzmatazz to him, very high stakes escapades that he was involved in. People say he was actually channeling him in James Bond and and in a lot of his novels. By the way, Frank Wisner and Ian Fleming were actually close friends. They were friends. And Frank Wisner, he himself went to elite schools. He graduated from Virginia and got a law degree from University of Virginia. Interestingly, he was a commander, right, of the U.S. Navy, though. Was a commander, lieutenant commander or commander, that is, in the U.S. Navy. He liked to smoke. You see a lot of his photos. He was a debonair-looking guy, and he was a womanizer. In fact, the FBI was J. Edgar Hoover started investigating him because he had an affair with a Romanian princess, and it was thought that she was a foreign spy, or she was influenced by communists, but he was cleared though. So yeah, so a lot of his razzmatazz, and then he moved in the Georgetown set. There was an elite circle. So amongst his friends were the publisher of the Washington Post. That's Philip Graham, right? Phil Graham, the owner of uh, the Washington Post, who committed suicide in 1963. He was a close friend of President John F. Kennedy. So Frank Wisner, moved in these elite circles, had all these elite people as his friends, had all these women, even though he was married, right? He was actually married. But it is said that Ian Fleming was channeling the lifestyle and the character of Frank Wisner in James Bond, right? In his James Bond novel. It's interesting. There was actually a an American naval officer whose name was James Bond. Interesting. In any event, I'm going to stop this video here. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I will keep you posted. Thank you.